Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's installment of ClueCon Weekly. This week with us, we have Chad Phillips from Apartment Lines and a lot of other projects. And I'm very happy to have him here. He's been part of the open source community for a long time. And I'd like to hear everything about his usage of FreeSWITCH and other open source stuff.
Yeah, so probably I was thinking about, how I might describe my career in coding, and it just seems like it's so erratic. Like I've been all over the place, so I don't feel like I have a succinct way to encapsulate things, but an easy track is just with FreeSWITCH. And so in probably about 2007, 2008, my small telecommunications company, Apartment Lines, was using Asterisk to do its answering and switching. And I just kept running into problems with Asterisk. It was not that it wasn't stable, but it couldn't do things that I wanted it to do that seemed like they should be easy to do. And at that point, then I just start looking around for other stuff, and I ran into FreeSWITCH, and it was still pretty young back then, 2007, 2008, but it was already quite capable. And so I had these specific set of maybe 3 to 5 problems that I couldn't solve in Asterisk. And I thought, well, let me just see if FreeSWITCH can do these things. And it did. It was able to. And then I just got really excited. And so I ended up, spending whatever 3 or 4 months porting over my entire code base from Asterisk to FreeSWITCH. And I've never looked back. And I've been really grateful. I really love the design of the software, the modularity, the flexibility, the performance. And then from there, I just got more and more involved in the community, because it wasn't just that the software was cool. The community just seemed really cool to me too. And so I started going to ClueCons probably, I don't know, it was 2008, 2009 that I started going. And I did a few presentations. I'm not a compiled language person. Like C is not my thing, but I've even managed to get a few patches into the source code, particularly in Mod Conference, because I did a lot of work with WebRTC recently. So I was actually one of the people that had the first full, like, more robust implementations of using Verto and WebRTC to do more complex video conferencing stuff. Unfortunately, that project didn't really amount to much, but I did learn a lot, and I contributed some good patches for it. So, yeah. And then the other thing, of course, which is what my talk is about, is Lua, and I've been using that for the more advanced scripting stuff in FreeSWITCH for 12 years now. And
Maybe
maybe
we could start from there. Like the Lua is simultaneously one of the most used languages in some areas, and a language nobody else knows about outside of those areas.
Yeah, it is kind of weird like that, right? I mean, so my understanding, and I haven't used Lua for almost anything else besides inside of FreeSWITCH, but I know that it's really big in the gaming community, and I know it's really big with embedded systems, and of course it's popular with those communities largely because it's highly embeddable, right? I mean, if you just look, I looked recently on my it's a Debbie and Jesse machine, so not Jesse, Debbie and Buster, so just like the previous version, and I just looked at the binaries for the interpreter and for the library of Lua, and that they're just a hair over 200K, that's the whole like interpreter is 200K, right? Like, it's just super tiny. And yet what they are able to get done with that in that small amount of space is just kind of miraculous. Like the design is so elegant that they're able to take the minimal amount of coding concepts and provide this kind of flexibility and power and speed. Lua is quite famous for being highly performant, not just for its small. And so, yeah, for all those reasons, it's just a really, and it's a really fun language. I was thinking about this recently too. I'd love to get your opinion. Which languages you land on, but I have a distinct flavor of how fun a language is. Does that make sense? Like some languages just feel like, I hate this. It's boring. It's drudgery.
I totally agree.
Yeah. So for me, the number one on that list, on the side of, like, I just don't ever want to do it because it feels like Java. Like, for whatever reason, every time I've ever worked with Java, it just feels like slave labor. But on the other side, I've got to put Lua. Lua might be my favorite language to work in, not because it can do the most things, but just because when I'm writing it, I'm just having fun,
Yeah, I think that's a lot. I think there's a lot there of what I like to my go-to languages are all. So I think I approach it slightly differently. My go-to languages are languages who have great tooling around them. So Ruby and Python over JavaScript, which has terrible tooling. JavaScript is just almost no tooling to speak of. There's a million different tools. They all don't do all the things we need to just develop, and
Right.
there's a lot of boilerplate. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the starting point. I can say I've used Lua much, to be honest, because so I'm a FreeSWITCH developer, application developer. I've done that for a long time, but almost all I do is done through mod XML curl.
Mm.
We settled on that a long time ago. It fixes a couple scale issues we had back in the day, and we stayed with that. I have a couple of projects sitting around from my previous life that are 300 plus servers talking to a web backend to serve the configurations. So there's that. So how would you describe Lua as a language for the people who know it? Is it
Oh
similar to?
God,
Does it
you
look
really put
like
me on the spot,
JavaScript?
aren't you? As I've been preparing my talk, I'm going to have this one section where I do it's just a language primer, and I really want to try to keep it short because I know FreeSWITCH is a conference full of developers, so I don't need to do a full tutorial, but I just kind of want to give this very brief look of like, here's what the language is like to look at, right? How does it feel familiar? And a lot of the construction of it is similar to your classic C languages. It doesn't have like semicolon terminators. It's a little more simple and clean like that. But it just, it kind of feels like Python or JavaScript, I would say, is if I was to pick two languages that it feels similar to. That makes any sense?
Yeah, it does. I
Yeah,
think
and if it's got all your constructs, looping, conditionals, that, and some of them have obviously every language has its own little flavor of those, but it's got all the basic tools. Probably one of the most interesting things about Lua is, and again, it kind of goes back to this whole elegant and simple philosophy that they've designed it with, is there's only one data type that is a complex data structure. Ultimately.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's called a table. So with a table, but they did it that way. And they also design it to be highly flexible. So as an example, a table can be used in like a list format where you just put elements into it, and then they're indexed, I guess, numerically, right? So that preserves order. So it's like a classic sort of like ordered array or something, right? Or an ordered list. But you can also do more like a record syntax where you have like, or you might call it like a hash, right? With just the key value pairs. So that it can be used multi-purpose that way. Plus, it has this feature called, it's a meta mechanism. I think the actual method is called set meta table, where you actually can set one table to be the metadata for another table. In other words, you can say table A is a table that has data in it, and table B is a table that has metadata information about table A. And so because of that, clever meta mechanism, you can make tables do all kinds of cool things. Like it's the foundation. If you want to program using object-oriented syntax in Lua, you use that particular meta mechanism of tables, and tables kind of become the objects that you work with, just like you would in an object-oriented language. That's kind of an example of like that. It fits those pieces together. Like it's one data structure, so it's simple, but it also has this elegance in terms of the meta mechanism that allows you to have this great flexibility.
I'm looking at the syntax. It doesn't actually have parentheses around the function bodies.
It does. I think those might be optional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I like
around the body. I'm sorry. Yes, around the body, it doesn't. You're right about that. Yeah.
I'm a Ruby
it's kind of a
and
more begin end kind of thing. Like everything ends with the end statement, I think is the way it goes in Lua.
So before we go into, I'd like to know more about what you've been doing and what your current endeavors are. But one last question: what can you do with Lua and FreeSWITCH? Because we are audience from all ilks. So there's what's the 2-minute version of what you can do with Lua?
Oh my God. Well, okay. So to take a step back, when you were talking about mod XML curl, I had this moment where I was reminded of just how much FreeSWITCH can do, because I barely know what XML curl does or is. I mean, if I remember correctly, it allows you to serve dial plan stuff from XML over like a HTTP connection, right? It's kind of something like that, right?
Any configuration file, to be precise. You can even alter the behavior of other parts of the server as in real time, like change the file that's being served, set it to be fetched every time it's invoked. You can influence pretty much anything.
Yeah. So I mean, here you are. That was like what you did most of your focus on. I'm like, I barely know what that is, right? And so in the same way, Lua is this whole universe. Lua FreeSWITCH integration is this whole universe. One that, frankly, I don't even feel comfortable calling myself an expert at it because I don't know every little thing that you can do. You know, I mean, I was just looking at the API reference yesterday in preparation for my talk, and I ran into a couple of things where I'm like, holy crap, I didn't know you could do that
Nice.
thing. I might use that little trick, coming up. So, but in essence, I mean, maybe the easiest way to talk about that is to say what I've used it for, what I think are good common use cases.
Yeah.
And so the two things that I have used it most for that really make it, extra useful in terms of extending the dial plan, because you can already do a fair amount with the dial plan. You do your basic decision logic. You can use the IVR menu stuff. I mean, it's kind of already pretty flexible. But if you want to talk to a database, that's one thing, right? So when you start needing to access data dynamically, like for my business, if somebody calls in, I want to look up the information for the customer from a database, right? And so Lua is pretty great for that because it uses the FreeSWITCH DBH abstraction. I use ODBC for the connector, and then I can talk to my database. Another one is talking to web services. So, maybe the canonical example would be you would have somebody calls in and they want to get the weather for a zip code or something, right? And so you can actually use, there's some, Lua has this concept of it has modules, and there are people that have built packages for things. So you could use a package. One of the more common ones is, oh my God, what's it called? I think it's just called the socket module, which basically allows you to connect HTTP or HTTPS. And so that would be, somebody calls in, they type in their zip code, you collect the digits, and then you call some kind of a web service to get the weather for that, and then you read it back to them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, even just simple access control. So is this a caller actually allowed to dial into this number or whatever? You can do, there's a lot.
Yeah, and it just opens up, you got, with the looping and even just the looping and conditionals that every language has, it just allows you to do a little more than the dial plan can do, right?
I think that for my limited experience, but I've used Lua a bit, actually, back in the day, building a couple of things. I think Lua is actually the best programming language for FreeSWITCH. Like, if you're going to do dial plans in a programming language, by all means, use Lua. Nothing is as supported, nothing is as effective. If you're doing XML curl, it's something that you build completely different. But if you do programming, by all means, use Lua. There's other mods, but they're less maintained. They're, there's all kind of things.
If I remember correctly, it's sort of the officially, recommended
it is
language
definitely
of the ones. Yeah. So
we use it internally at SignalWire.
I mean, I would hope so. It's got I think you were kind of pointing to this too. It's got this sort of virtuous circle where it does a good job, and then more people want to use it, and so then the module gets more attention, so then there's less bugs in it, so that it works better, and then you just go around and around, and it just kind of becomes stronger and stronger.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, you're also right. You also brought out something that I'd like to point out to the audience. FreeSWITCH is so big as a platform in itself that there's entirely different sets of people doing entirely different things that don't know about what the others are doing. I will not be able to touch them. Like, I know of many large-scale FreeSWITCH users, so the developers that work for companies and have built large platforms, who don't even know what Mod Conference is. Oh, right. That's cool. You can do video conferencing. That's awesome. Right. Yeah. It's been there for 10 years, but you do.
Well, and that's a whole world. I spent 4 years of my life mastering Mod Conference when I was doing my video conferencing platform. There was a period there where I didn't. It was kind of like Verto Communicator, and what I was doing were the only two complex video conferencing things that I had seen. So that's a whole world. You're right.
People doing pure telephony. There's again, we have a couple, even customers, SignalWire. We have the supported version of FreeSWITCH from us, and we do large telephony, and they use FreeSWITCH as an SPC, as a call routing engine, and as a voicemail recording engine. And nobody there has ever heard about Mod Conference. And you go show it. It's wow, that's great. Yeah, I didn't know. So
it's pretty amazing.
It is there's a lot in there.
Right. So I would say be aware if anybody says they're a FreeSWITCH expert, like whatever, like there's no way you know it all, except maybe the core developers would be in that,
Yeah, unless it's like 4 people.
Right. Exactly.
those four. You got Tony and the team probably
Right,
know.
exactly. They're the ones that actually know could say that, but I think everybody else kind of would have to fit into their slot, you know.
Yeah, it is. There's too much to know. It's a gigantic platform. So, what do you use FreeSWITCH for nowadays?
Well, so I probably should talk just a hair about the WebRTC stuff. It seems like I didn't quite give enough information there. But I built a platform for online group meditation, and that involved a very complex dance between doing a bigger group of people, say 30 or 40, and then smaller groups of people, say 2 to 5. And so that involved a lot of complexity handling the video stuff. And so that was where I got really involved in the WebRTC stuff, on conference, Verto. That was unfortunate that project didn't make it. I mean, if you've done anything with the WebRTC stuff, you know that it's insanely complicated to do real time media, especially the video stuff. And so I was basically trying to do that whole project by myself. And after 4 years, I burned out. But I did learn a lot, and I contributed like a lot of what Verto, I kind of was instrumental in helping to kind of work out a lot of the edge cases in Verto because I was trying to do really complex stuff.
Oh.
So yeah, so that was, that probably from 2015 to 2019. And then the through line though has been my primary business, which is an answering service, and the Lua is the backbone of the more complex stuff that I do. With I don't really use it for call routing. I can get mostly done in the dial plan, but looking up customer data, manipulating customer data, that's pretty much what it's used for. I mean, it's kind of, my business is very dependable, and but I've never felt like it's all that interesting to talk about. It's just like, oh, it's an answering service,
Well, I mean,
but the problems that I have to solve are interesting to me, like using Lua, figuring out like how do I use Lua or whatever other piece of FreeSWITCH I need to do to solve a particular problem. That feels interesting to me.
What does Apartment Lines provide for their
It's answering
customers?
services for apartment complexes. So it's basically like if it's a cost-effective way for apartment communities to be able to have their phones answered when they're out of the office or in the evenings, because it's way more expensive for them to pay an employee to like sit there all night and wait for a phone call than it is to pay an answering service to answer on their behalf. So we've specialized in apartment communities we're going on 18 years now, and
Wow.
And there's some special, there's some special needs that you have to take into account when you're answering for apartment communities, opposed to say doctors or whatever. So I mean, just as a really simple example, we have this filtering mechanism where each apartment community can say like, well, these are the 10 things that I considered an emergency that I want an operator to talk, that I want to be able to have somebody talk to an operator. And so we will list those situations for the caller before they can talk to an operator. And so since it's different for each customer, that's a perfect example of like that whole database lookup and the looping stuff, where I get the customer data, and then a person wants to talk to an operator, and there's a step where I pull the list of situations that they say that they can talk to an operator for, and I kind of concatenate those audio files and then give them to FreeSWITCH and say, play all these audio files so the person knows what they're allowed to talk to an operator for. And so that's the kind of thing, like you couldn't do it with the XML dial plan, right? Because I got to talk to a database. I got to kind of composite the list of the situations into a big long audio string that FreeSWITCH would understand how to play, that kind of stuff. So it's a perfect example of where you would farm out, some more complex functionality into a more advanced scripting, or something that's not the dial plan, into a scripting language. And to be fair, you have to say like any of the modules that are Python. I don't even know what are, like, you've got, is Ruby one? I know there's a Python one.
Yes,
there's a JavaScript one, but I mean, whatever the other ones are that are wrapped like Lua, they all could probably do basically these same things. But I think
Ruby exists, to be fair. There's
okay.
The only
ones don't crash, right? They all can do the kind of things I'm talking about. I mean, I think this, and I'm going a little far afield, so I don't want to go too deep and misspeak, but I think a lot of them, the APIs that they're referring to are quite similar. The underlying APIs, like they can write to the console, they can make an API call, kind of thing. Yeah. So So we have
To
to
be
give
fair,
all
I
these
think
languages
the
their due and say you could use, if you love Python and there's a Python module, you don't need to use Lua. That it's just Lua is more fun and it's
I
more
think the
stable.
JavaScript and
It's
Lua ones
fast.
are the only actual. I think the JavaScript and Lua are the only actual modules that I have a good amount of support.
Mm.
Like then again, to be fair, you don't really need to super update something like a module like that. Once it works, it's really just embedding the
Right.
programming language. So it's the Python one works. I know
Mm.
for a fact. I don't know what the Ruby status is, but you can do a lot for it. That's
Yeah.
pretty open. Still, if you want to try it, people in the audience try Lua. It's probably going to be a better experience if you're doing
Well,
FreeSWITCH stuff.
right. And I would say if you're, to me, the decision tree would look something like, are you neutral to the language you would use, just want to use the best thing, then use Lua. If you have no experience with language and you want to start using it, start with Lua. If you're like a total Python guru and you don't want to waste the time learning Lua, then okay, maybe use Python. I don't know the performance considerations though. Lua is a lot more embeddable. So if you're going to if you're going to be using those kind of scripting techniques in your dial plan and you're trying to do some kind of decent load on your server, I think you might notice a difference if you're loading in Python versus Lua. I mean, the entire wrapped mod Lua, I looked at that too, is under a megabyte. That's
Yeah,
with
so
the
it's
FreeSWITCH functionality and everything, right? So if you're processing a zillion calls and calling Lua a bunch of times to do custom stuff, I think you probably start to notice your server bogged down if you were using a heavier language compared to
yeah,
Lua. And you get
probably
your own environment. Every single call, it's probably worth saying too. Every single call that comes in, it literally loads up its own Lua environment for that particular call. So get your
which
own.
is something you can't necessarily do with a lot of other environments just because they're heavier. So there's
Right,
just that
exactly.
too.
Totally.
Full isolation is certainly something to be aware of. Then that can be very useful for sure.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. So, couple things. You've been part of the ClueCon community for a long time, Dan. You've been there
Yes,
for. I mean,
that's a couple years old there, right?
I've been there for just a few years, and
Mhm.
I always like hearing from people who've been there for even longer. What's the why do you like ClueCon, and what do you recommend attending the conference?
I love that you asked this question because as I was, uh, I don't want to say preparing, but just thinking about, I'm going to have this, I'm going to do this talk with Luca later, and what we're going to talk about. It did cross my mind, just conferences in general. And so, probably the easiest way for me to clearly describe what I love most about ClueCon is by comparison. So, in about 2003, I got involved with the Drupal community. So, Drupal sound familiar? It's like a big content management
Yeah,
system. And back then, it was very small. I'm trying to remember. I think the first conference I went to in Amsterdam probably had like 40 or 50 developers. So it was small and it was very nerdy. You know what I mean? Like we were all just geeks trying to make this platform work. And so it felt very engaging to me. And then time passed, and I don't remember exactly when it kind of jumped the shark, but it started to get where you would go and there would be like 3 or 4,000 people there, and it all just felt like people marketing their products, which was a
yeah,
total drag. It was this magical community that kind of just transformed itself into more like a standard, like corporate conference type of thing, and it was a total bummer because I knew what it could be, right? But ClueCon has somehow managed to maintain its developer centric focus. I don't know how. It's not that it hasn't become a little more commercial as times pass, but the essence of like it's a conference by developers for developers has been maintained, and I just love that about it. That I can go there and I'm going to hear talks that aren't just somebody pitching their product; they are technical talks. I mean, like the one I'm going to give is I'm not pitching anything. I'm just there to say Lua's awesome, right? Like come check it out. And if you need to do anything more complex, I'm just going to show you how to get started.
yeah.
So yeah.
I know the organizers are trying to do a lot in that space. Like the idea is to keep ClueCon uh relevant for the technical community because there's been less and less of those kind of occasions coming up. That you're right.
Right.
It's I mean the honestly my favorite two conferences are ClueCon and FOSDEM in
Mm.
Belgium. which is the
Mhm.
open source. So FOSDEM is wacky. It's 5,000 people. That used to be 10,000
Wow.
people invading the University of Brussels, and there will be people everywhere coding up stuff. It will be very dangerous to just spin up a computer without any kind of firewall, because you get killed
Get
in
hacked.
minutes.
Right.
We actually tested that at one point. I was doing a security workshop there, and we spun up a Linux box, and it was started getting attempts to hack in like 30 seconds, just because
Wow.
there's at any given time there's like 500 scanners running that network. So it's particularly
Yep.
interesting.
I
But
asked a
the
FreeSWITCH core developer once, like between the time you spin up, say, an AWS box, you just put one up for whatever, right? And what's the average time between when you spin one up and when there start to be inquiries for it to get hacked? And he said, 30 minutes, maybe an
yeah, I
hour if
think
you're lucky.
it's
I mean, it's just deadly out there,
it can be fast. It can be even quicker if you are on a. It can even be quicker if you are on a known IP class,
Mm,
such as you're spinning up on one of the more crowded IP classes for DigitalOcean or AWS or whatever, Google,
mhm.
whatever. That it's minutes, literally minutes. So yeah, it is.
My God.
It's quite interesting. So, speaking of the open source community, what's your experience with the open source community in general, and
Mm,
what will you do? What will you change? I have a feeling that contributions are decreasing in the last few years, and I don't know if
mm.
you share that feeling. And what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, of greatest concern to me, I've I've read some articles, and this seems to jive with my personal experience, that open source maintainers are under greater and greater strain and getting less and less support. And that's a very bad combination with the fact that like seems like there's a lot of industries have like come to rely on open source some of these open source projects to get their work done, and so that's you just look at those two things together and it seems like a recipe for disaster. And so that's just a big concern for me. I've been involved with open source since probably 2003. I just love it because it feels like, this is probably a bit inelegant way to say it, but it's like the closest thing to the socialist ideal that I've ever seen in our
Mhm.
world. It's like this idea of like, oh, let's all just take our good ideas and put them together, and I'll share my good ideas and you share your good ideas, and we can all benefit. And like it works. It basically, yes, of course there's problems, but I mean, like as an example with apartment lines, I don't, minus maybe like an Adobe product or something we need. I've been paid for any of the software. Nothing. Like I run Linux servers, I run FreeSWITCH, I've run, all these other open source projects to be able to do the different things, databases and proxy servers, and they're all open source. I haven't paid a dime to run my business on this software. All it took was an investment in time to learn how to operate each particular one, and then I can make it run. And that's amazing. Like that wasn't something that could happen. I'm not sure when, I may not be accurate with my clock, but say 20 or 30 years ago, like that, when before open source really broke out, there was no chance you could do that. It just seems like a miracle, And so
For
I
sure, yeah.
feel very protective of that miracle. I want it to continue. And I don't really, I'm not deeply steeped enough in how open source communities are kept healthy to know, but I know it's important. You know, I'd like to see. I almost want to see something like this. Well, maybe this is reaching too far, but not government funding, but some kind of help. I've thought about, like, can the Linux Foundation, like, what are they doing to kind of feed funding into some of these open source projects that need more support? It just seems like some kind of outside financial support for developers would be great. I mean, I have a small little project that I maintain. It's the one open source project that I'm probably like the most popular that people use,
Mhm.
and it's just me. It's like I don't know how many people use it, probably a couple thousand or whatever. But like, if there's a problem, there's barely. I get a little bit of help, I have to say, but
Yeah.
it's not like there's a team around me. It's like I'm basically the person doing it, and I suspect that there's a lot of open source projects that suffer from that same problem. It's one person or two or three people doing it, and yet there's a lot of people depending on it, and it's just a
Yeah,
bad
they're
situation, and they're not appreciated, right? I think open source contributors don't get the kind of appreciation they really deserve, because they're, I mean, I took me 5 months to build this little thing I'm talking about, and I spent, I'm talking 5 solid months, right? And I've put in quite a bit of time for no pay, just because I wanted to do it. And yet people can bitch about the fact that it's not working right, and there's something drastically off there when you're giving away your life's work and people aren't satisfied. So
Anyone who has been yelled at on a open source project mailing list knows the
yes,
feeling. Like why haven't you fixed my problem? Well, I have a job and maybe you
yeah,
could do it.
right,
And you haven't given me a proper bug report even, because when I ask for logs, people look at me like I just sprouted, I don't know, a third eye in the middle of my forehead. Like,
yep,
logs? So
yeah.
you're
I think I'm kind of getting older and crankier. Like I've started posting up on some of the projects that I have that I won't. If you want support, I recommend hiring a company consultant. Like I kind of don't provide any kind of support. If you file a pull request or you give me a clear bug description and I can prove that it's a bug, I'll look at it. But I'm not gonna provide free support. Like that's sort of where I draw my line. You
Yeah,
know.
if we have to give one recommendation to the listeners and to the community at large, is if you don't have the ability to contribute a patch, which is fine. I mean, I don't know C either. I mean, I know a little bit of C like everybody, but
Mm-hmm.
not enough to help. At least try to provide the clearest and more descriptive bug information that you can find, like all the logs, how to reproduce. And that's if you give an open source maintainer the complete reproducible scenario, chances are you're getting that fixed.
Right.
If I can just run a call and say, so if I do this and that and the outline is built like that and FreeSWITCH crashes, great, we can fix that in 15 minutes. If
Right.
it's my FreeSWITCH is broken, fix it, you incompetent people, then maybe not. Maybe you
Right.
even get yelled at back, because honestly.
Right.
So the most important thing is always reporting an issue is the more precise and complete way, and that will probably get you help. That's something that's very underestimated. Like when I
I would
ask for
say that.
logs, people say I don't have logging in my application. That has a few that raises a few questions, like how are you actually running that app? Like how do you know if it's working?
Right.
But I won't delve too much right now.
Well, and I'm gonna go one level of challenge more too, and I don't know how deep I want to go into like how I'm learning this about myself, but I'm really getting that if I don't, I think suffer might be the wrong word, but like there's an investment of time and effort, and which usually involves some discomfort that allows you to appreciate things more. I mean, so as an example, somebody logs on to a website, they download this piece of software, they pay nothing for it, they get it in 5 seconds, right? And then they start messing with it and it doesn't work. Now they're frustrated. Why doesn't my
Yeah.
thing work? Right. And like so that encapsulates sort of the entitlement mentality, if you will, right? Like this
Yeah.
thing should work for me and I shouldn't have to pay for it.
Guys,
Whereas
please try get it
yes,
running.
but if you
And
actually like, if it doesn't work, and like say it's an open source project and it doesn't work, and you're like, well, it might take me 4 hours to understand anything why this doesn't work, but maybe I can figure it out. And so then you dig in, and then you don't understand it, and then you get uncomfortable and frustrated, but you keep going, right? And then maybe you fix it. But that particular process not only gives you greater appreciation for the work that was involved, but if you can actually succeed, then you get a confidence boost. You maybe make headway into some kind of community of people that you can
yeah.
that you can
Well,
share
my
experiences with. I mean,
entire
there's so much you got to invest though. You can't just expect that things are going to all magically come to you. The investment and the discomfort and dare I say the suffering is the foundation upon which the great gratitude and the rewards can be built. Does that make sense?
and people should just look at me, for example. My entire journey into voice over IP, starting from one of the big four consulting companies, which I left because it was too much stress
Mm,
and time outside the house, literally started with a couple small contributions to a Ruby framework called Adhesion
mm-hmm. Oh,
that
I
led
remember
me
Adhesion.
into
Yeah. Uh-huh.
being hired for work, then creating a company, then joining Sangwire, up to
Mm-hmm.
here chatting with you people. So that's all because I fixed a rounding error in a timeout function.
Right.
Literally all there is to it. Like I barely knew Ruby at the time, but I had found this framework and I needed it for a project I was doing with an Italian customer here. And I found that you couldn't set half second timeout times, and sometimes I would need a half second time because a second was too long, because a second of silence when you're doing telephony is a lot.
Well,
So we
yeah, for
wanted to
sure.
have it a little bit shorter. And
Right.
just that patch, 10 years after, well, 12 years after, I'm here. So,
Right.
guys, just try to do whatever you can. I didn't think I could say I knew Ruby at the time.
Right.
I read the code and found, hey, there's a round function being called here that
Mhm.
shouldn't be there, or should have a 1 decimal more, so it doesn't round to the number, but it rounds to the half number. And
Right.
that's all that was
You
needed.
see,
So
that's you putting forth the additional effort, right? Like you were willing to stretch yourself. And if
yeah,
I
to be
was
fair,
going
I'm
to
not even
encapsulate
sure.
this in one
To be
way, I
fair, I'm
would
not even
say,
sure my code made it into the actual patch, because I was written by someone who barely
right.
understood Ruby, had no tests, etc. But me going the effort of trying to fix it led
Yes.
to people actually wanting to do it the proper way. Like, oh, right,
Right.
Lucas, right, let's do it so it actually works. But
Exactly.
this is right. So that's very
See that,
important.
and that illustrates. So I was thinking like this way to encapsulate what we're saying is, it's like code doesn't grow on trees.
Oh, perfect. Yeah,
It's produced by people doing work that feels hard and challenging and comfortable. And so, join us in the work to help make things better. It's not this magical thing that just happens. Like we make it happen. The developers make it happen, and we could always use support.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. So, nearing the end of our chat here, I would like to remind everyone that Chad will be speaking at ClueCon in Chicago. ClueCon is going to be in Chicago from October 25th to 28th.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still crossing my fingers that the U.S. government lets me in the country, but if not, you'll be able to meet Chad and a lot of other very
Mm-hmm.
interesting and very competent people at ClueCon. And looking forward to seeing you there, either online or in person, depending
Mm-hmm.
on whether I can cross the border legally.
Right on.
And I want to thank you, Chad, for joining us today. It was a great chat. We looked at a lot of
Sure thing.
interesting things, and looking forward to your talk at ClueCon.
Yeah, man. Come learn about Lua and FreeSWITCH. It's going to be fun.
Absolutely. So thanks, everybody, and I'll see you next week.